it's true that white men came to this country looking for spices. And it's also true that there would not be a United States if there wasn't a trade dispute over dumping. And it was the same British East India Company that was dumping tea at a very low price onto the American market, and it really angered the tea distributors on the East Coast. And that was really the beginning of the United States. So globalization, and particularly the global trade in agricultural goods, is as old as mankind. Now, when there was a British Empire, the British Empire benefited profoundly from it. And when they followed a mercantilist policy, they used their colonies as sources of raw material that they would exploit. But once it was in their interest, and once they had a very strong manufacturing base, they turned to, quote, free trade, unquote, because it was in their interest. Again and again, you see the terms of world trade being dictated by the dominant world power. The only free trade there is right now, I would argue, is that you are free to give large sums of money to the Republican Party, and in return, you will be able to trade.
The globalization of food we're hearing about, and I think this goes to the answer of what's sort of new about it, right now is largely a supply-driven phenomenon. And much of that drive originates in the American Corn Belt. So I want to, at kind of warp speed, follow a bushel of Iowa corn through the food chain. Specifically, corn from a farmer named George Naylor in Sheridan, Iowa. He's just harvested, and he harvested 200 bushels of corn an acre. A lot of our food system is about figuring out ways to get rid of those 200 bushels of corn an acre. So 60% of it, on average, we feed to livestock. It goes to factory farms. 10% we eat ourselves in the form of high fructose corn syrup and other goodies that are made from corn. 10% we feed to our cars now, and it will soon be more in the form of ethanol. And 20% we export. Much of that 20% finds its way to Mexico. And the reason I want to talk about Mexico is that it's kind of ahead of the curve on globalization. They have already opened their borders. They have already kind of globalized their economy under NAFTA. The U.S. has doubled its exports of corn to Mexico. So why does Mexico, the ancestral home of corn, buy 200 million bushels of American corn today? Well, in a word, because it's cheap. Because farmers like Naylor can sell it for less than $2 a bushel. And this is almost $1 less than it costs to produce that bushel of corn. So how can that be? How do they sell corn for $1 less than it costs to make it? Well, that's a complicated story. And subsidies are the culprit you always hear about. And it's certainly one reason. The government is cutting a check to George Naylor for every bushel of corn he produces. But I would argue that that mountain of cheap corn that's washing over the world right now preceded subsidies and will survive their elimination. The key factor in all this, the supply-driven kind of wash of corn across the world, is not subsidies so much as overproduction, simply the astounding productivity of an Iowa cornfield. Much of the yield growth that's driven all this corn, created this mountain, has been pushed by government and industry. And it's usually been done under the banner, the blameless sounding banner of feeding the world. Yet it turns out that in the real world, too much food is almost as big a problem as too little. The same mountain of cheap grain is contributing to the obesity crisis in this country, because all that corn is really the building block of Eric's fast food nation. It creates the cheap beef, it makes possible the big sodas, the big gulp. And it contributes in other places to hunger, which sound from Africa to Mexico. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive. How could this be? Since NAFTA, about 10 years ago, the price of corn in Mexico dropped 50%. This collapse in the price of corn, the result of all we're exporting, has forced 1.3 million farmers off their land. They can't compete against the flood tide of American corn. So where do they go? Well, they join the pools of the unemployed in Mexico's cities. And many of them migrate to the United States, where these former farmers end up picking our food to send money back home. That too is part of the globalization of food.
There is no other part of the world where 750 million people make a living in agriculture. And yet that 750 million people's livelihoods and lives are threatened because of a new trade system, which I believe is based on two totally illegitimate principles. The first is the principle of the right to dump, which is sell below the cost of production. And I agree with Michael, it's not just about subsidies. Because anyway, subsidies given to farmers to grow for the domestic market don't hurt farmers in another region. It's subsidies linked to reducing prices and then selling the product overseas, under a condition where you don't have a right to prevent that kind of import because of the removal of import restrictions and all the laws on market access in the WTO agreement. And the second, I would call the right to force feed. To say that Europeans don't have a right to say no to genetically engineered food, or now, after August, don't even have a right to regulate the GM imports with labeling, segregation, and traceability laws. These are force-feeding laws. And that is the real problem with the free trade agreements. They are about forcing trade on unwilling producers and unwilling consumers. The virtuous globalization can only be based on localization first. First, because food, unlike anything else, needs the soil, the biodiversity, the water, and unless we conserve those, we are never ever going to have virtuous production. Secondly, if we cannot maintain farmers on the land and guarantee livelihoods through robust local economies, we are not going to have virtuous trade. Thirdly, if we have to enrich each other's lives through adding of diversity and quality, we have to ensure that that quality and diversity is maintained where it belongs, in local cultures and local ecosystems. And that is why global trade can only be supportive of ecologically sustainable agriculture, local production, with leftovers reaching global markets. Leftovers reaching global markets on fair trade principles, just prices, and mutual giving and taking between consumers and producers. And just because you sit in a stock market and can bet on the global casino, it doesn't make you a superior human being. It just allows you to have more disposable income, and you have a duty to put more of it back to maintain the earth and to maintain farmers.